Okay, terrific project and terrific findings. And I should add, that's important, this is of course a multi-year project 2013 and then 2015, and the 2015 part was funded, or most of it was funded by the Danyliw Foundation. The deal was brokered at the summer school in 2014, which was also funded by the Danyliw Foundations, and we're getting now actually breakthrough data. So that was my first institutional, that's it. But let me just reiterate what I think are your three major points, because it's hard in a short presentation to make it very, very bold. So let me do that for you, because I think it's very important. The first point, you're saying, you know, we've been talking about 20 years. Is it ethnic or civic nationalism in Ukraine? You know, Western Ukraine, it's ethnic, it's more civic in the East. And your first finding is that, well, that cleavage is actually within the oblast, particularly in southern, now eastern and southern Ukraine, and we see significant shift from, you know, interesting variation, the dynamics between 2013 and 2015. So that's the first finding. Now the second, about the national myths, it starts with the Holodomor presentation, was it a genocide or not, but then it moves to, well in time, it moves to the heroes of World War II, Upa or Nupa, that would be the next session, whether they're heroes or villains, in the War of Memories, and then it moves to the heroes of Maidan, the heavily hundreds, the Vesna Sotnia. Now, what you're showing is that there's a similar dynamics going on. It's no longer west versus east, but within the greater east or southeast, there's actually a great deal now of variation. And the younger, the more educated, and the wealthier, put in your paper, and the more you actually are favorable to these national myths, that the Holodomor was a genocide, that the Lupa were heroes, and so forth. So again, very interesting. And again, when we're talking about Southeast Ukraine, from Russian, puts in perspective, that's Ruski Mir. So that's the data doesn't quite fit the Ruski Mir narrative, admittedly. But then, your third point is that on what we would call the memory of the Soviet experience, not in terms of national myths, I mean in terms of daily life memory, meaning the street signs, the statues and so forth, there's resistance. Then you've got clearly a cut, and there's not much movement happening in the southeast. So that's an interesting in itself. They didn't have, even though they're all gone, but of course the laws of decommunization. So three very significant, I think, findings, which leads to my first question. There's another finding that you kind of buried. The finding is that you ask in 2013, 2015, what's your nationality? Right? Ukrainian, Russian. And in 2015, we actually see very significant variation upwards for Ukrainian, downwards for Russian, where? In all the frontline oblasts around the Ato, around Donbass, Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, Odessa, Mykolaiv, even Chernivtsi for different reasons. Here you see the number of self-professed Russian in terms of the question is nationalность, nationalность, Russian nationality. People know what that means, right? Then it plunges in Zaporizhia from 24 to 12% in 2 years. So you see that this kind of Ukrainization of previously self-identified Russian. That's a major impact of the war. That's in the paper. The paper will be online today, so you'll see the very, very interesting data. But on language, so that would be my question. And all of the previous stuff was my kind of framing your findings. On language, you use the category native language, Rodna mova, rodной язык. But clearly, that was not how the data was collected. Did you work with the Kiev Institute? No. Okay, because the data makes no sense instead of Rodna mova. The Rodna mova is, when you look at census data, we see very, very high level, even in eastern Ukraine, for Ukrainian, even pre-2013. But the kind of data that you show, which is normally the kind of data that we get from the Kiev International Institute of Sociology, is the language that people actually prefer to speak. which is not quite Ridnamova, language of reference, of convenience, and that's the data that you're using, and there's not much movement there, because people still continue to speak Russian a lot in southern and eastern Ukraine, but the context is changing. That's what you've explained in terms of even street signs and so forth, and certainly attitude toward the language. So I'd like you to comment maybe on the language category.
Yes, I choose only Ridnamova because I was talking about identity, and nominating certain language as my native language is more of identity choice. And of course, we had a big block of questions asking about real everyday practices. Whether you are using, in which context you are using, and when you come to this point, the numbers dropped significantly. But I think this is important just to see which language is viewed as native. And there is a shift, 10%, between 2013 and 2015. And what recently published data from Razumkov Center demonstrates that actually in 2015 we had a situation when the atmosphere was, it doesn't matter which language you speak, because you go to Ato, you go to Maidan, it doesn't matter. But what's now is happening in 2016, that Ukrainian language is gaining more and more support, like as an important marker for identity, because there was a list of markers, and in our list, the Ukrainian language was within this ethnic identity, ethnic nationalism category, and it was priced very low. But Razumkov Center data show that actually now it's going up. And people are starting to rethink about the importance of Ukrainian language as a part of...
Sure, but that's different from what they actually use. I mean, what do you use? Because clearly, the tables you have, that's not Ridnamova, that's what people speak. But then their relationship to the language, which, well, actually, when we ask Ridnamova in the census, often it's the relationship. They'll say it's Ukrainian, even though they speak mostly Russian. And as you just explained, the relationship is shifting upwards in terms of how you view it, which is different from how you use it.
Thank you, Hanna Shelest, Ukraine Analytica. It was very interesting for me to follow because in the end of 2015 we made similar research, but for the Bessarabia region only, which is very multi-ethnic. So some of the findings for me was kind of interesting for comparing, and because of these, I have a question. When you were asking about Ukrainian identification, were you emphasizing that you're speaking about ethnic or national identification? I mean, were your respondents really understood, is it about your ethnicity or is it belonging to the state? Because especially when you go to the multi-ethnic societies, it was quite a serious issue for them. And also, were you paying attention about the change of the self-identification to the ethnic minorities? I mean, because for many of them, we even made a public campaign. I'm Moldovan, but I'm a citizen of Ukraine. And for these people, when they were saying Ukrainian, it was mostly meaning the same as the citizen of Ukraine. So were you noticing any, let's say, changes because of this?
As for the first question, first part of the question, we were not differentiating in this part when you propose like whom do you, what's your nationality, and then you have Ukrainian, Russian, because then it became much more complicated if you say Ukrainian citizen and then Ukrainian Russian, yes? But in the questions about markers of identity, there was a formulation for you as a citizen of Ukraine. And actually we also had a block which I didn't show here. We were asking this similar set or even more bigger set of questions with markers. What does it mean for you to be Russian, Hungarian, Polish, Jew, whatever was stated in the first place? But unfortunately, with exception of Russian minority, all other minorities are very small, in small numbers in our data. So I cannot talk about any statistically valid trends using this data, because we do see some shifts, but if you have 10 to 30 persons in your survey, then I cannot talk as a sociologist.
In Marinkovska Harvard University, my question is about European identity. You show us quantitative data that European identity, contrary to what we show from the images of Maidan, was not changing a lot, and it was also not very much pronounced, so it was less important. In your qualitative interviews, do you receive any kind of explanation for this phenomena, or you can just elaborate a little bit more from your qualitative part of interviews about these findings of your project? Thanks.
The difference is whether you ask about European identity or you're asking about the political situation, whether Ukraine would, how do you think, what is the future of Ukraine, whether Ukraine should be whatever, and then you ask about European Union, and here you have a clear shift. So when it goes to political affiliation with Europe, this definitely yes. When it comes to identity as a European, here is the problem, and I think the problem is very much embedded in educational system in Ukraine, because we still have two different courses of history. Native Ukrainian history, this was from the Soviet time, because there was USSR and enemies history. And we still have the same. We have Ukrainian history and world histories, two separate subjects. And when you have binary opposition, you always have us and them. And when we also ask a question, I didn't show it, how do you think to which part of the world historically Ukraine belong? And we ask Europe, we ask East Slavic community, and none. So we had the same 15% for Europe. So people do not relate themselves to Europe as a part of their historical memory as well. And I think this is partly because and if you ask a pupil about the same period in Ukraine and in Europe, they could not match together processes. Because these are two different courses, two different classes, and you just memorize it, that's it. And I think this is very important thing to change. Actually, these data were presented to our Ministry of Education, so I hope that the situation...
Anthony?
Director, DIY country again. It's really, really interesting study, and of course it's sort of something that potentially people will be referring to for a while, potentially to justify various policies and so on. I was very interested about the data in Donbass. I guess that's the most controversial. There's been a lot of people moving from pro-Ukrainians who moved out of Donbass and so on, and obviously access is quite tricky there. You mentioned that you didn't go back to Donbass, right? But I couldn't understand because there's a lot of data in 2015 of people's opinion of their nationality and so on in 2015, and I'm just wondering how that data was obtained, and also how you dealt with issues like selection bias, preference falsification. People might be scared about revealing their true nationality because they think that you're a spy or states are going to be used against them, or to bring war to them, or even that you're from the Russia, from the rebel side, and so on. So there's I'm just wondering how you were able to sort of obtain your what you think the error bars might be in the data, and how you sort of became comfortable that basically nothing's really changed despite everything. That's what the data seems to be mostly showing there. Sorry for rambling questions.
If we are talking about quantitative part, we didn't collect our data on those parts which were occupied.
But aren't there plots that show?
Unfortunately,
I'm missing.
I'm working with GIS map, and this GIS map is not cutting that part off. So we conducted our survey both in Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, but only on those territories which are under Ukrainian control.
Okay.
But I also participated in a project of in-depth interviews, interviewing people both on Ukrainian side and in Donetsk and Luhansk. And for these purposes, we were using our local in Donetsk or in Luhansk sociologists. So, and if we have, I know that CMIS conducted several surveys, including those occupied parts of Donbass, but for me this is a very big, the same situation as in Crimea. For example, even for in-depth interviews, we needed only 10 in-depth interviews in Crimea, and we couldn't get them. Because people are agreeing to talk, but not on a tape recorder. And we used 4 different types of interviewers, like local Crimean Tatar, local Crimean Russian who came, sociologists who came to Crimea, and Ukrainian sociologists who came to Crimea. Nothing really worked. So people are really afraid of talking, but in Donbass situation is different. In Crimea, we're facing much more difficulties obtaining the data.
Then you.
I'm Danielle Johnson from CNA in Washington, D.C. Thank you for this. It's obviously an enormous amount of work, and I think will provide a great baseline for lots of research to come. My question is about the media environment, and I know that you can't establish any kind of causality, so I'd love for you to speculate on the relationship between the media environment and some of the either stagnation or transformation of identities that you've seen. I was in Kiev recently and heard a couple of things that I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on. One is legislation and moves to ban Russian content in the government-controlled areas and in Ukraine. And also, there's this debate going on among journalists in the country over journalistic standards during a time of war. So this idea that you should be a patriot first and a journalist second, and that's really paving the way among a lot of media that the reform process overall in Ukraine is being covered and the war in general. And I'm wondering if you had any sense from people based on the media that they were viewing, whether they were accessing it through satellite and still able to access Russian content, for example, whether there was any kind of relationship between the data that you've seen and any shifts that you've seen, and these kinds of shifts in the media environment as well.
This particular study was not dealing with media, but I was involved in one project analyzing media in Lviv region, and I also can relate you to other studies, for example, which were conducted in Kharkiv Oblast about the media situation in the environment. So, and we were, part of this project was actually in-depth interviews with experts about the situation in media, and all of them were saying that we are going from an analytical type of media more to emotional and self-censored, because I cannot say certain things because of the war. And they are saying that if we are talking about freedom of speech, of course, this is a big problem. And another issue is that journalists cannot work on the other side. So actually we know quite little what's happening there. We can get some information from social media, from informants, but again, it's not the same as media coverage. And finally, many local media do not have resources to send their journalists to the spot, even on Ukrainian side. So what they are doing, they are picking up news or images from and reproducing them without actually thinking to what extent they are presenting real situation on the spot. So there is a problem. But if you are much more, and what we also do, I do a lot of trainings for journalists about how to present situation with temporarily settled people, because we have quite a number of media information about stereotyping, othering them, and even if they are not othering, we have a situation where people already resettled and are living for 2.5 years in a particular city, but they are still constantly picking up for some media coverage. As if you would move from Washington to Boston, you would not be picked up as a resettled person constantly. And imagine yourself if you're trying to become local, whatever, Kharkiv, Kyiv, Lviv person, and you are constantly grabbed and reminded that you are do not belong here.
As we are running out
The time I will take two questions, Ivan and Kachinovsky and Jesse, and then I will take questions also from Zoom.
My first question about survey.
try to be short, please.
Okay, so it's a very short question about who actually conducted survey and before Maidan and after Maidan in kind of locations. And second related question, did you conduct a comparison of two surveys, excluding Crimea and separatist control of Donbass, part of Donbass, because this would be more relevant comparison, more wide comparison, and if you have, and also to have separate data for Crimea and separatist control of Donbass, part of Donbass, for understanding kind of reasons for conflicts there. So, thank you.
And Jesse, you take your question, please also.
This is really just following up on Anthony's question and to make it in a slightly sharper way. Do you think that the sample has changed in Donetsk and Luhansk from when you did the first survey than when you did the second survey? I understand that you don't have any data from controlled territories, so I get that, and Crimea too. But in the part where you can do the survey, the demographics have changed and social desirability bias. So conditional on taking the survey, people's the taboos that you wouldn't feel as bad about violating, that might have changed too. So have the numbers changed? And if the numbers haven't changed and the social desirability bias hasn't changed, then what has changed?
Both surveys were conducted by. The first one was conducted by rating group, which is quite well known in Ukraine, and the second one was conducted by Socio-Informed. They have their local networks with which they were working, and of course sample for the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast 2015 sample was adjusted to the information, because building a sample you can also relate to surveys which were conducted by other sociological groups, and we do not have exact statistics, of course, because our last census was more than 14 years ago, but you can try to get whatever you can get. The level of response rate is very low everywhere.
Okay, in both rounds. The refuse to answer or I don't want to take the survey rate was low in 2013 and 2015. Yes. Great, that's what I wanted.
Well, was a comparison. If you saw that in brackets, I always showed the data without Crimea. And in my paper, I everywhere mentioned that to make it more comparable, I can take off Crimea, but of course I cannot take off Donetsk and Luhansk.
And then let's take three. I saw three hands. You and you. Go ahead. No, I see the lady first.
Victoria Thompson, Carleton University. I have a question about change. You said that it shifts from ethnic identity to political identity. Identity, I feel it's very big term to call it change of identities, especially between 2013 and 2015. Also, can it be just a shift of political preferences because as response to outside threat, yeah? And I conducted research in Eastern region, And between 2005-2010, region identity in eastern Ukraine were much higher than identity with Ukraine. So can we say that it's just temporary or it's shift? Thank you.
Okay, here when I've
Three at the same time? Okay. Victoria, keep this one.
A very quick question. What is Gang Ottawa? In your 2015 survey, did you separate out the internally displaced people and characterize them in some way?
My name is Elliot Cho. I'm a student at Halton University, and I have a question with respect to the role of the Alpha veterans and the Heavenly Hunters in the nation-building process in Ukraine. So I can definitely see that their role is imperative in the nation-building process that is ongoing as an effort to counter the Russian propaganda and teach children that why they have to make these sacrifices for the nations. And so is there a lot of efforts that's going on in Ukraine to teach children that and as a way to answer these difficult questions why they had to make these sacrifices and I don't know, create empathy for the sacrifice of these veterans at all? That's the question that I want.
And it will be the last one. Is there a question? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Go ahead.
Victoria Hudson, King's College London. Thank you very much for presenting your impressive findings. I also did a sort of quantitative and qualitative research in Ukraine, not such a large scale as yours. But when I was doing focus groups in the east of Ukraine, and Kharkiv specifically, a particular East Ukrainian kind of identity was often articulated. So they considered themselves Ukrainian, but it was a different kind of Ukrainian from, say, those nationalists in Western Ukraine, as I understood within the group. I'd be interested to see if you found such a thing.
Yes, exactly. I was doing focus group in Crimea in June 2016, just a few months before everything started. And my people there were saying, let those West Ukrainians go to Poland and finally we'll live in our Ukraine. But nobody was talking about joining Russia or we are Russian or specific kind of, yes, they had their own Ukrainian project, but this is what I'm talking about. It's very important what people bring as important markers. As of nation building, I don't like this term. I would rather say re-articulation, which is happening. And if we are talking about efforts, no, I don't see any, because educational system in Ukraine is quite backward and very slow and very centered. So before everything goes from top down, it takes ages. We did not separate, we were not asking whether a person is resettled or not. This was a completely different project that was involved. It was Indepth introduced with resettled, but of course focusing on identities and re-articulation of their identities. And finally, about the change of identity, we have markers where people actually decide what is more important and what is less important. You can have both markers, or many markers which are important, but what we have is see that importance of political markers are growing and importance of ethnic cultural markers are actually going down.
So let's thank you, Victoria.